somebody, I think if you read that, Emery, your textbook, which I'm sure you have on numerous occasions, that they said for some ethnicities, a fourth of them were returning. They were coming to make money so they could buy land in Europe, or start businesses in Europe and then go back. But in some cases, I don't know if it was the Italians or who, that there was a large number of people who were considered birds of passage. Now, we said that the huge influx of people, whether they were immigrants from the countryside in the United States, immigrants from Southern, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, whatever, people converging in these metropolitan areas presented problems. There were problems with the cities. And the biggest problem was, where were you overcrowding? Where are you going to put these people? Where are they going to go, right? And, we said that the central kind of housing unit that these people that migrated to cities lived in were called dumbbell tenements. Now, tenements in general are kind of low-income private housing. These are the slums. The tenements were places where landlords knew that they could get rent from people and not maintain them. And the most famous of the tenements was the dumbbell tenements, because the way they were organized, and there's a picture in your book, you'll look at it when you study it tonight. Each of you kids will spend 4 to 5 hours studying tonight. And when you look in your book, you'll see this floor plan of a dumbbell tenement. And one of the things that you'll notice, Jessica, is on this floor plan of a dumbbell tenement, which tended to be like 7 to 8 stories high, that not every apartment had running water. That they had washrooms kind of in the hall, that 4 or 5 apartments that sometimes had multiple families living in shared. And so these were terribly uncomfortable living conditions. They were not only uncomfortable, they were disease-ridden. It wasn't like you kids when you go on that decadent Ocean City trip and you all jam into some kind of, and you're stepping over each other. It's kind of fun, is it not, Emery? Not for, but I mean, this is like for real, right? And this is disease and overcrowding and crime and frustration. And we said, well, look, it didn't seem like anybody wanted to do anything with the kids. Oh, what was that guy that wrote the book's name? Jacob, R-I-I-S, how do you say that? Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. What was the name of that book, anybody? Anybody? How the Other Half Lives. And he really chronicles, the conditions of urban America, the slums of the cities, the difficulty of the immigrant poor that lived there. And we said that because the national government, and because state governments, and because the churches were less anxious to help these people, big city political bosses built their power by providing fundamental social services to the poor in these cities. We talked about Boss Tweed, big city political bosses. We talked about the connection between the impoverished migrants that came to these cities and the power of the political bosses. And we said that it took some time before the power of the bosses would be broken. Oh, incidentally, what is this notion of social Darwinism? What is this notion of social Darwinism? Emery, we spoke extensively about social Darwinism. What is this notion of social Darwinism? Who knows besides Samantha and myself? Go ahead, Samantha.
Social Darwinism is kind of like...
Social and Darwinistic.
No, it's like you kind of let the natural way of life happen. Like, if you're poor, then you're like made to be poor, but if you're rich, then that was like your destiny, sort of international.
No, there are elements of it there. Yeah, I can buy that. But Jason wants to add a little bit to it. Go ahead, Jason.
This idea of how society evolved so that the more fitted gravitates toward top and the less fitted gravitates toward bottom.
So you're saying that what we associate with social Darwinism is this notion of survival of the fittest? And survival of the fittest in a social Darwinistic context involves society, not the biological world? And that some people in society have attributes, traits that enable them to succeed. Who were they, incidentally, always? Who had the traits that enabled them to succeed according to the social Darwinists?
Like the high class.
The rich, the millionaires, they had the traits that enabled them to be successful. And the poor...
Sumatic, please call 5741, Sumatic 5741.
And the poor did not, correct? And so there was an evolutionary process where the traits of the rich would sort of be passed on, and they would accelerate, and this would allow society to advance, and the traits of the poor would die off. And this is unfortunate, but this is the way it was. Oh, who was the architect of this notion? Does anyone besides Meredith and myself remember who we associated with social Darwinism? Go ahead, Meredith. Herbert Spencer. Also in the United States, somebody called William Graham Sumner. Now, how was social Darwinism different from the social gospel? How was social Darwinism different from the social gospel? Anyone besides myself remember that? Social Darwin. Courtney, do you recall the differences between social Darwinism and the social gospel? They are fundamentally different, are they not?
Yeah.
Yes, they are. Go ahead, Meredith. Well, no, social Darwinism and the social gospel is different. Yes, go ahead, Samantha.
Wasn't that when people said in the settlement houses that Christians have the responsibility to help them?
Oh, so you're saying the settlement houses and the social gospel were ways of addressing the issues of poverty, dear Samantha?
Yeah.
And in the social gospel was saying that Christians had an obligation to assist the less fortunate, and the less fortunate might be less fortunate because of circumstances rather than their own personal failings. And are you saying this, dear Samantha, that oftentimes, or the dispute amongst people in terms of poverty in urban America was who was responsible for the poor? Were the poor themselves responsible for their plight, or were circumstances responsible for their plight? And the social gospel you would say, those people suggested that circumstances were the reason, as did the settlement house. What person do we associate most often with the settlement house? Go ahead.
Jane Addams.
Jane Addams, 2 Ds, right? 2 Ds in Jane Addams, right? Who we associate with the settlement house. And what was a settlement house? Dear Sarah O'Toole, what was a settlement house?
It was like a house where
People
the
settled.
poor, yeah, they settled in.
Yeah.
And the poor could go to, and they'd like teach kids and teach how to like be clean and give food and stuff.
So it's a social service agency that provided things for the less fortunate in parts of the city, which kind of recognized and acknowledged that maybe changing circumstances would help these people. So the settlement house movement, the social gospel, would be kind of anti-social Darwinism, would it not? To some extent, yes. Now, there is a discussion in your text about a couple of things. One is education. The notion of free Let me get that.
Should I get center? I don't feel like moving it. This is really interesting. I just feel awful like recording it.
They're looking for the robotics team. Has anyone seen them? Anyone seen the robotics team anywhere?
The whole robotics team right here. I have nothing to do with the robotics team.
Well, anyways, let's do this real quick. Oh, we must hurry. Samantha, we must move along. In terms of this discussion, so read it in your book. But there's something called the Morrill Act of 1862. And the Morrill Act provided land for public universities in the West, kind of, land grants. And it resulted in a number of land grant colleges, right? Land grant colleges, which were intended to kind of promote agriculture. And kind of for us, the most famous of these land grant colleges is, of course, Penn State University, right? Which was a land grant college. That's why you can still major in agriculture there. That's what people that desperately want in do. They major in agriculture and then change their majors, right? You know, so Penn State, not you, Emory, because the Emorys go to Ohio. That's the tradition, right? You know, so Penn State was an example of a land grant college. So there is a discussion in your text about that and a question on the test. There's also a question on the test about Henry George. I'll tell you about him. I mean, so you might want to look in your textbook for that. The other kids aren't going to know unless they watch the YouTube. Blot this out, please. No, we'll go dark. I'll be He's shaking the computer. You know, so Henry George was a reformer.